morning, everybody. His Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to USAC. It's a pleasure to have you here. We have a really distinguished guest from United States of America today with a really interesting topic, Iran post-JCPOA, a new opportunity. Before we start, I would like to introduce Richard to the audience, and I'll give the floor to him later. Richard, between 2011 to 2013, was a director for Iran at the National Security Council. And later, he served as the principal deputy for inaugural coordinator for sanctions policy with Dan Fright at the United States State Department. And currently, he is a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings in the Foreign Policy Program and affiliated with the Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Initiative host with the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence. He is also a research scholar and program director at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. His present research is focused on the use of sanctions for deterrence and impact on present U.S. foreign policy challenges. Today, Richard will talk about what should we expect or not after the JCPOA, which was agreed between the P5+1 countries and Iran. There were so many expectations till then. Some of them has been fulfilled, but some of them are still waiting to be fulfilled. So, Richard today will show us the lights. Where are we going? So, the floor is yours, Richard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, everybody, for being here today. Really appreciate the opportunity to meet with all of you, to talk with all of you. And I'm hoping that after I offer some introductory remarks that we can have more of a conversation. I'm interested to hear what your questions are, what your thoughts are, and what your concerns are as you look at the nuclear deal that was struck and what will happen thereafter. I think I would offer three main messages when you think about what the nuclear deal ought to mean and what it has meant and what it will mean, in particular for U.S.-Iran relations and for the broader developments in the region, as well as the international non-proliferation regime, which is an important element of the deal too. The first is that the hostility that you see between the United States and Iran is real. And I think that there was an expectation that it was going to all of a sudden be different the day after the nuclear deal was struck. That expectation was wrong, and I don't think that we ever should have had an expectation that things were going to change that quickly. It's the product of a sustained period of mistrust from, frankly, both sides, and that both sides have both some responsibility in creating and responsibility in sustaining. And so really at this point, the idea that there is no change in how the U.S. and Iran perceive each other ought not be the surprise. The surprise ought to still be that it was able to change in the first place to allow the nuclear deal to come together. The second main message is that the nuclear deal was a tactical arrangement, not a strategic deal, that dealt with two major challenges. For the United States, it was Iran's nuclear program, and for Iran, it was the sanctions regime that were ever steadily damaging, and you can even make an argument crushing, the Iranian economy. By having this tactical arrangement, we may yet get to a strategic arrangement. But that is not yet guaranteed. And it's really a question as to what happens now and what both the governments in the United States and in Iran, as well as all other governments who have an interest and stake in this, do that will determine whether or not we have a new strategic relationship between Iran, the United States, and Iran and its neighbors. The third point I would make is we now have an opportunity, especially now that Iran's nuclear program has been constrained through the deal, to make the strategic change that we all want to see. But we have to strike now. We have to move now to try and rebuild this relationship and to have a better relationship come out of the process because Iran's nuclear program is under restrictions for the next 10 to 15 years. If we don't change the strategic environment that Iran is facing, and if the relationships that we all seek don't manifest in the Middle East, we could be right back in the same spot in 10 to 15 years. And I think that's a really complicated and problematic proposition for us all to think about. So let me break down these three messages a little bit further. First, on the issue of U.S.-Iranian hostility. I think that when we were entering the negotiations, we in the United States knew that we were not starting some new beginning between us and Iran. Frankly, the way in which we handled the talks is indicative of that. We started the talks in secret. And we started them in secret because there was no chance of us sustaining the talks if political opposition forces in Washington or in Iran had heard about them before we had a nuclear deal that was done. I can tell you from spending a lot of time on Capitol Hill in Washington that had I gone up to them and said, we're thinking about starting a secret back-channel set of talks with the Iranians that are going to involve us stopping sanctions in exchange for them stopping their nuclear program, that I probably would have been arrested before I left the Capitol building. And I might not have gone to jail, but instead to an insane asylum. Because it was common knowledge and common expectation in Washington that no deal could be struck with the Iranian government that would solve our nuclear concerns with them, that wouldn't cause undue damage to the sanctions regime and some of the forces that we had in opposition to Iran, what Iran was trying to do. I think that for as much as I talk about the difficulties that we faced, however, it's nothing compared to what the Iranian diplomats faced when they went home to Tehran. And we're talking about having a new nuclear arrangement with the United States and with other partners that would constrain Iran's nuclear program for some period of time in exchange for having the sanctions come off. First of all, it had been accepted Iranian policy that there would be no constraints on the nuclear program, that the full exercise of Iran's rights under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, as they saw it, was an absolute unassailable given, that there would be no nuclear deal if it made Iran do anything to restrict its nuclear program, that Iran would accept no further transparency and monitoring constraints. And the idea that Iran would trade nuclear concessions for sanctions relief, which had already been established as being, on the one hand, something that was immoral and illegitimate, and on the other hand, something that didn't even hurt Iran at all, and something that they could actually prosper from as part of their narrative, was, I think, similarly anathema. So there was, I think, in both the United States and in Tehran, an expectation that if we had told people about what we were negotiating before it was ready, that the political forces that we would have faced would probably have undermined it. And I think this goes to a fundamental question and issue around the nuclear deal and getting it, if not passed, at least accepted by the Iranian parliament and U.S. Congress just this last fall. It was based, and the support that we derived was based on the idea that we were still hostile to Iran, and likewise Iran to the United States. Go back and read any of the testimony that you heard from U.S. officials, including Secretary of State John Kerry, about the nuclear deal. Throughout it all, he talked about the benefits of the deal and how it was going to be in the U.S. national security interest, but he also talked about how we retained sanctions to deal with all sorts of other Iranian bad behavior. The fact that it hadn't fundamentally changed our relationship, that we were not pursuing this deal on the basis of trust or a good relationship, but rather of distrust. And people even took the Ronald Reagan saying of trust but verify of U.S.-Soviet arms control and turned it into distrust and verify. All to make a rhetorical point that the administration was not seeking to revolutionize the U.S.-Iranian relationship and didn't see it as a precondition to getting a deal done. Instead, the administration sold it as a tactical arrangement to deal with the nuclear problem, and the same thing on Tehran. Throughout it all, even people who had sat across the table from me, from Secretary of State Kerry and for other U.S. officials, spent their time defending the nuclear deal as a blow against the Great Satan and a way of keeping the Great Satan at bay, and how they were restoring Iranian rights and Iranian independence, and they were going to ensure that Iran's national power was not infringed in any way. That is not the message from a state that is looking to have a new positive beginning of its relationship with the United States. And importantly, I don't think that's a problem. There are some people who advocated on behalf of the nuclear deal, as I did, who believe that this atmosphere of distrust is a problem that will undermine the nuclear deal or undermine any chances of success. I think the opposite is true. That if the United States had gone farther in trying to build a relationship with Iran than the popular support would have allowed, the deal would have died in Congress. And I think the Iranians face the same sort of issue. This idea of mutual mistrust, of mutual even dislike, was necessary to allow the nuclear deal to move forward. And that without having that, it would have been difficult for both sides to have demonstrated that on this issue we may agree, but on all these issues we're going to remain adversarial. And I think that to some extent, the reason why the deal prospered derives directly from this continued atmosphere of disagreement and even hostility. But I don't think we should undervalue the accomplishment that was reached in the nuclear deal. As I said earlier, Iran had made a determined position for years that they were not going to accept any infringement of their nuclear rights, even voluntary. After the stalled European initiative in 2003 to 2005, the Iranian government had as official state policy, we will not accept any infringement of our nuclear rights. The reality is the nuclear deal does represent an infringement of Iranian nuclear rights, albeit for 10 to 15 years in a way that was done with reciprocal concessions from the United States and from other countries. But still, the Iranian position had to move quite a bit. So did the U.S. position. When we started this whole effort, and I was working at the Department of Energy at the time, we were allergic even to the idea that Iran would have uranium in the country. And I am not joking, I had discussions at the Department of Energy as to whether or not it was possible to remove all uranium from Iran, because there was a concern that any uranium in Iran could eventually lead to nuclear weapons. We had to have a quick conversation about the fact it's in the ground and they have mines and it's kind of hard to remove that, at least without doing all the extraction stuff you have to do in the first place. But the concern was very real, that any nuclear material present in Iran was potentially nuclear material that would be diverted to nuclear weapons. And the idea that sitting here now, that the United States government has accepted that Iran would have uranium enrichment not only today, but going into the future, is a big concession. It's a big move. Now, countries like Turkey might sit back and say, it's not that big a concession, because all countries have a right to have uranium enrichment, a position on which my government differs with Turkey. But from an American perspective, it was a big concession. It was a big move. And accepting the idea that after restrictions ebb, Iran's nuclear program was theoretically unrestricted, I think was a major step taken by the United States. I think what's also important to know is even though it was a tactical arrangement, it's thus far working. And if it is going to work for the next 10 to 15 years, it's only going to happen because of continual effort on the part of American, European, and Iranian officials to ensure that both sides are getting the benefits that they paid for. Now, from the United States and European and Russian and Chinese and broader international community perspective, this means that the nuclear concessions and nuclear restrictions have to be maintained and they have to be fully enforced. And there was a lot of question in the United States in particular whether or not Iran would fulfill its terms of the bargain. I had many arguments, both in person and over Twitter and various other different platforms, with people who said that Iran would never fulfill its commitments. People who said that Iran would begin cheating almost immediately. People who said Iran would attempt to have more uranium than it should, more heavy water than it should, and would attempt to break all the thresholds and boundaries that it had accepted as part of the deal. These are the same people, by the way, who also made this argument on the initial agreement that we reached with the Iranians in 2013. And in both cases thus far, they've been proven wrong. The International Atomic Energy Agency has reported twice now that Iran's still fulfilling its obligations. But it hasn't been smooth. Iran did produce more heavy water than it was allowed to under the agreement in January to February of 2016, by the tune of about 0.9 metric tons. Now that might not seem like a lot. And from a technical perspective, it's not a lot. But the big concern that folks had on the skeptical side of the deal was that Iran would slowly but surely change all the margins. and would make it the new normal that they would be allowed to have that extra material, that they'd be able to do this kind of nuclear activity that's not permitted, so on and so forth. The reality is that as required under the deal, U.S., European, and Iranian officials met, and they discussed how Iran could get back under the thresholds that it's required to maintain. And Iran did that, and the IAEA was able to report it as well. So it's not as if there hasn't been already a violation on the Iranian side of the nuclear terms. There has been. But what's important, and what should give us some hope for the future, is that it was resolved. It was resolved without sanctions being reimposed. It was resolved without a lot of hostility. It was resolved quietly, diplomatically, and using technical means, simply by exporting more of the material than they were required to. On the sanctions relief side, there has also been difficulty in getting implementation stood up. And I don't think this is a surprise to anybody who's here in this room. Legally, the United States and the European Union and the UN Security Council have done all that they are required to do. All the sanctions that were required to be suspended in the United States have been suspended. President Obama signed all the various different pieces of paper, and those that he didn't sign, Jack Lew and John Kerry signed, to make the implementation of sanctions relief active the moment the IAEA verified Iran was doing what it was supposed to do. The issue is that Iran hasn't been able to reintegrate with the global economy as it hoped, and as the deal forecast, but didn't actually make a requirement. Now, why is that happening? First off, I think we have to look at Iran. Iran remains a very complicated place to do business, for bureaucratic reasons, for regulatory reasons, for security reasons, and frankly, I think it will be such until some of the reforms that President Rouhani is attempting to push through are able to make it through all the various different steps that they have to pass. He needs to have the supreme leader support them. He needs the security services to accept them. That's a lot of work that needs to be done. And if he's able to do it, then a lot of the internal domestic Iranian difficulties will be eased. The second set of issues are the residual sanctions that still exist from the United States and from the European Union. I think a lot of folks look at sanctions and see it as a U.S. attempt to keep business from going into Iran even as the nuclear deal was negotiated. I would just remind everyone that Iran knew full well what scope of sanctions relief was on offer. And they knew that there were still going to be sanctions that deal with Iranian support for terrorism and violations of human rights in place. It was a conversation I had many, many times with my Iranian counterparts while I was still part of the negotiating team. But I think Iran felt, and we felt, that those sanctions would not be an inhibitor of business as much as they would be a complicator of business. In my opinion, that's what we're seeing right now. We're not seeing a prevention of new oil and gas deals, of technology support being provided to Iran, of trade and investment ties beginning to flow. What we're seeing is that they are complicating the decisions by all the economic actors who have to decide whether or not they want to go inside of Iran. And in fact, when you talk to banks, when you talk to companies, they don't say that we're legally prohibited from doing these things. They say we're concerned because we're not sure whether or not the risk and the reward calculations work out to have us go back and do business with Iran today. And this really leads, I think, to my third major point on why business hasn't been going back to Iran. It's the oil price. At the end of the day, it's my opinion that if oil was $100 a barrel, we wouldn't be having this conversation now. Businesses and banks would be going back into Iran because there would be a lot of profit in it. At $40 to $50 a barrel, there just isn't as much profit in it. And that is a fundamental economic situation that Iran has to deal with, that we have to deal with in the United States, that Europe has to deal with in making the deal work. But I think it's also something that we have limited flexibility to be able to change. What will change, all three of these factors, in my opinion, is time. And I think it's the time of having people see that the nuclear deal is being fully implemented by the Iranian side, that sanctions aren't being reimposed, at least not without good reason, to see whether or not oil prices change, and to see whether or not some of the risk-reward calculations can change. Now, time, though, is fleeting. We have 10 to 15 years with the nuclear restrictions in place. We also have got political clocks that have already started in Washington and have started in Tehran and have started in various other different capitals around the world. In Iran, we obviously have a presidential election that will be coming up next year. And that's going to be an important indicator of whether or not Rouhani still retains the support of his population, both for the nuclear deal as well as for all the reforms that he has been pushing, and for a different sort of foreign policy than was practiced by his predecessors. You may have heard that we're having an election in the United States as well, and that it's not without controversy, and that it's not without controversy dealing with the Iran nuclear deal itself. I am not a U.S. political analyst. I'm just a citizen like any of my colleagues here from the United States, so I can't tell you what will happen. I can tell you what I hope doesn't happen, and I can tell you what I hope does happen. And I think that if Hillary Clinton becomes the next president of the United States, the nuclear deal will be implemented fully and faithfully as it was intended. If Donald Trump is the next president of the United States, I think to some extent all bets are off. Prior to his getting the nomination, I would have argued that any Republican president would have maintained the nuclear deal so long as it was working. And there's some historical basis for this. Ronald Reagan campaigned against the Algiers Accord, which settled the Iran hostage dispute between the United States and Iran. But when he was in office, he maintained it. And for the simple reason that the number of crises he had to deal with around the world didn't suggest opening up another one. I think the same argument would have held true. I can't make the same commitment on behalf of Donald Trump, and frankly, I don't know what will happen in a Trump presidency. I hope we don't find out. But I think that assuming that we have a reasonable course of action in front of us and a reasonable next president of the United States, we've got a period of time in which we can build on the accomplishment of the nuclear deal as it stands to try and improve both the regional nuclear non-proliferation environment, regional security environment, as well as to build on the relationship that we may have started up again with Iran on the nuclear deal. And I think what that will require is basically three baskets of things. First is resolution of the various different regional security and instability questions that are in the Middle East. I don't have to tell people in this room that the issue of Turkey, or rather the issue of Syria, is of particular concern not only to Turkey, but also to Iran and to countries in the region. The degree to which Syria is resolved diplomatically and peacefully and becomes a place of stability, I think will be a major component in what happens in the U.S.-Iran relationship, as well as Iran's broader acceptance in the region. But it's not the only one. The future development of Iraq, what happens in Yemen, the degree to which there is some modus vivendi, if not an agreement on how to deal with one another in the Persian Gulf. I think all of these regional stability and security questions are going to weigh on whether or not a new relationship can be forged out of the nuclear deal. And I think that resolving these various different disputes and concerns and making them a source of stability rather than instability is an important predictor of whether or not we have a new strategic relationship emerging between the United States and Iran, and more broadly with Iran and the international community. Second, I think we have an opportunity, but also responsibility, to see if we can change the future direction of weapons of mass destruction proliferation, particularly in the Middle East. I do not believe, and I recently published something with Bob Einhorn at the Brookings Institution that says this, that the nuclear deal itself is going to spur nuclear proliferation in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, and other such places, even though there's an argument that some skeptics of the deal have made to suggest that this is the case. But I do think that there are a number of things that we need to do to make my prediction, and to some degree my hope, reality. And that includes by coming up with a way in which countries in the region with interested people from outside the region can figure out what the future proper development of nuclear power and other potential enablers of weapons of mass destruction like ballistic missile systems are going to look like inside of the Middle East. I think if you had an unregulated proliferation of ballistic missiles and of nuclear technology in the region, it would be pretty dangerous. And it would be a recipe for security, instability, and security dilemma. making sure that we have worked through those questions such that when Iran emerges from its legal restrictions, it's in a different Middle East, and a Middle East that has a different view of nuclear proliferation in particular, I think will be very important. And we've got to spend the next 10 to 15 years strengthening the institutions in the international community that prevent proliferation and trying to build bridges between Iran and other countries in the region to ensure that it isn't a catalyst of real crisis. And the last thing I think we need to do is we need to find a way for crisis management to emerge in the Middle East. In particular, in the Persian Gulf, dealing with the United States and with Iran, and as well as other countries in the Gulf as well. If you take a look at the situation that developed when the U.S. sailors accidentally went into Iranian waters and then were quickly held, released, and the situation was resolved very quickly, that ought to be the model of how we handle potential for crises in the region involving Iran, the United States, and other countries, and Iran. I fear, though, that to some extent this was a function of the fact that Javad Zarif and John Kerry have built a relationship in which they could quickly communicate with one another, tamp down concerns, and to be able to work out some kind of arrangement for the release of those people. One can very easily imagine that situation turning into a real crisis, as frankly happened when a group of British sailors and Marines were captured by Iran in 2007. My concern is that with the increased tensions and hostilities that occur in the region more generally, and particularly between Iran and its neighbors, the potential for similar such incidents, but not similar resolutions, creates a possibility of real peril, and having individual crises spiral out of control. And so beyond solving the problems we have today, we need to also solve potential problems that we can see coming down the road that involve potential friction points on nuclear proliferation and so forth, but also deal with just plain people being in the same sort of body of water and same sort of spaces all at the same time. And figuring out a way for there to be new security and stability structures, maybe some form of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, but now for the Middle East, is an important next step to be able to tamp down some of these concerns as well. So in close, I think we stand with a situation that is better than it was 5 years ago, but it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. And I think there's much more that needs to be done to build on the success of the nuclear arrangement to try and make it have a broader and more long-lasting impact in terms of building stability and security and eventually in prosperity in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for this comprehensive analysis. I suppose there are so many questions and also answers in your presentation. So before giving the floor to the audience, I may say that there are a couple of things to be underlined here. One of the things that should be underlined, I suppose, after the sanctions period, the business environment hasn't changed so much in Iran. I suppose oil prices is one of the things, but as you mentioned, also the upcoming elections in the United States create some questions. What will be the next steps to be taken by the presidential office towards Iran, and will there be a risk, if thought of us, for the business sector? So I suppose everybody is holding their horses up until the end of the elections this year. Another important thing is that you mentioned here the sanctions did not inhibit the investments in Iran and will not mean they will be promoting the investments in Iran instantly. I suppose this is right, but also the Iran step towards being integrated to global economy may change the situation dramatically depending on the current government steps to be taken in the next period. As you mentioned, the issue was solved with a technical approach rather than a militaristic approach. This is something welcomed by the Turkish government after the JCPOA declared. The Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs said that they are happy happy with a peaceful solution to be taken between P5+1 and Iran. And I suppose since 2007, Turkey was promoting this kind of a diplomatic solution. A couple of things remain to be unresolved in the region. Syria is one of them, the situation in the Gulf, the tectonic shifts with the Arab popular movements, and the sectarian divides in the region. These are creating a really unbalanced and unstable situation in the Middle East. And as you mentioned, maybe we need a couple of other approaches, maybe institutional security establishments, which will bring different approaches to the region. Thank you very much indeed. It was really a comprehensive approach. Now, I would like to give the floor to the audience for whom would like to ask some questions to our guest. Yes, Deniz Bey. And before asking your question, may you introduce yourself? Thank you.
Ekrem Deniz, East-West Studies. And after the agreement with the Iran, the tension increased between Saudi Arabia and the States. Also, tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia. What will be happen? Can you expect, not only with Saudi Arabia, about Oman, Emirates, Bahrain, with Iran, what will be happen?
No, I think it's a great point and a great question. What can we expect may be different than what would we like to see? What I expect in the short term is continued hostility between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I don't see any prospect of that changing anytime soon. I think that in Saudi Arabia we have a generational change that we haven't seen in quite some time, and a new set of policies are emerging out of the kingdom that are just different. I think we knew what to expect from Saud, right? We knew what to expect from the Saudi government for approximately 30 years in foreign policy. We don't know as much what to expect now. On the one hand, people have said that Saudi Arabia is becoming more adventurous, right, and trying to deal with Iranian problems that they see in places like Yemen and Syria through direct physical action. The bombing in Yemen is a particular case in point in all this. I think that that's certainly been the initial response, to deal with problems that Saudi Arabia sees in Iranian policy through force, and to demonstrate that Saudi Arabia, I think as they see it, won't be kicked around anymore by Iran and won't delegate its security concerns to the United States or to its partners. It's going to take direct action where it deems necessary. I think there's some benefit, if one can look at the situation in Yemen as having benefits, to this approach, though, and that is the Saudis haven't really enjoyed great success in it thus far, right? I think they've gotten criticized pretty heavily in the international community for the bombing campaign in Yemen. They've had a lot of people ask the question, why are you doing it? When will you stop? What are the circumstances in which you're going to climb down from this position? And I think the Saudis over the course of the last 6 months or so have been looking for off-ramps in a way that preserves dignity and honor, but also will lead maybe to a diplomatic solution. That's where you've got things like the initiatives that the Saudis have been working through with the Houthis in Yemen to try and come to some kind of resolution of the conflict. From that perspective, if we assume that is a straight line, right, I think we had a period of pretty significant hostility and tension, and you may argue even overreaction, as some of my colleagues in Washington would say, to what the threat that was actually physically posed to Saudi Arabia from the Houthis in Yemen. But now they're coming to a much more stable sort of approach, right, and not trying to solve things kinetically, through force if need be. If you marry that up with an Iranian interest in building up new ties and to try and actually have a broader, more reasonable, more constructive foreign policy in the region, as Zarif has certainly been forecasting, Rouhani has been as well, then you've at least got some prospect of things getting better in the long run. But I think that while there is this concern about what the future holds, you're still going to have a lot of hostility. So what I think has happened is a lot of hostility, a lot of nervousness, a lot of concern. Now, what should we do about it? I said that we should try and look for something like the OSCE for the Middle East. I think we need to do that in part to deal with these concerns, right? You need a forum in which you can have Iranian, Bahraini, Saudi, Emirati, everyone in the region who has a stake come together to talk about particular problems and concerns. It doesn't have to be a decision-making body. It doesn't have to be a place where you come in and decide, so now the solution will be this, that, and the other. That would be ideal, but we don't have to start there. What we need to start is a place where dialogue can happen, right, as opposed to just shouting at each other in the press, which I think is, if we don't change the trajectory, where this potentially could go. Does that help?
Thank you. Now I want to add. What is your opinion about the Gulf of Persia or Gulf of Arab? What will be happen? With the Turks, solve the solution, Basra Gulf. Gulf of Basra, yes.
I worked in the U.S. government for far too long to not use the official U.S. government term, which is Persian Gulf, and that is the official one that we are all supposed to use. So I'm going to stick with Persian Gulf because my government training, and that's my opinion on it too.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm the head of mission of the Arab League. Non-proliferation in the Middle East, it's not resolved yet. There is still Israel that has its ambiguity concerning the nuclear weapons, and it's estimated to be a nuclear regional power. Decisions made by the review conference, extension and review conference of 1995, the resolution of the Middle East, and then the efforts that have been and the decisions made by the review conferences in 2000, 2005, 2010. I think the P5+1 have always avoided to get engaged in solving this problem. So it's a sort to say that this problem of proliferation and weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons is still irritating and is still an urgent problem that is not solved. What do you think the perspectives for that?
No, thank you for raising that question and that concern. You know, I don't work for the U.S. government anymore, so I can tell you what the U.S. government. I can tell you what the U.S. government position is on that, but I can also tell you what my perspective is based on that position, having worked on this issue quite a lot. And I was at the 2010 review conference, for instance, of the NPT. So one of my jobs was as the Middle East team chief in the Non-Proliferation Bureau, where I spent half my time dealing with Iran and half my time dealing with the NPT review conference and all the issues associated with pursuing a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. Look, the U.S. government position has been for a very long time that we wish to see a Middle East that's free of weapons of mass destruction and the means of their delivery. And we want to see that throughout the region. So we don't want to see ballistic missiles. We don't want to see weapons of mass destruction throughout the entire Middle East. We also recognize, though, that there are ballistic missiles in the Middle East, and we recognize that there is at least a position of ambiguity by the Israeli government as to what its nuclear program is and what it will, composed of in the future. Israel, for its part, just for all clarity, has said it won't be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into the region, which is a very interestingly worded set of points. But as you say, it's been widely suspected and alleged to have nuclear weapons and has had for a long time. And that has stalled non-proliferation work in the Middle East. There's no question of that. Now, I spent some time in Cairo around this time last year, actually, talking with some folks in the foreign ministry about even small things we could do to improve non-proliferation in the region, or things that aren't even nuclear related. Why can't we have an agreement on no chemical weapons in the Middle East? Especially after everything that was happening in Syria, it seems like a good thing to do. And the concern that was expressed by my Egyptian counterparts was we can't do anything more on non-proliferation, even if we don't have chemical weapons, right, and don't want chemical weapons, while we have this unresolved question about Israel. So I think there is, without question, you're exactly right, that the question about Israel and the question about Israeli nuclear doctrine and policy is limiting movement on nonproliferation in the region. I think that's without question. But it doesn't have to. And I think this is my main point. Look, Israel is not going to resolve the ambiguities that surround its nuclear program until it feels safe and secure, right? I think that's a fundamental point that whether or not they should or shouldn't makes logical sense. Israel stayed out of the NPT because it wanted to preserve its options. It has no legal obligation not to have nuclear weapons. Whether it does or doesn't, it's kind of immaterial. It's reserved that as an option. And the reason why, as the Israelis have stated, is look around us. We're surrounded by hostile states on all sides, blah, blah, blah. And I think there's been movement to address those concerns for quite some time, right? They announced that policy and they would decline to join the NPT before there was the Camp David Accords in 1979, right? But they still are in a position of security dilemma with regard to other states in the region. And now states are saying they have a security dilemma with respect to Israel. In my opinion, waiting for us to solve all these issues at once would have been the same thing as waiting for the United States and Iran to solve all of our issues with each other at once. You're dealing with Hezbollah at the same time we're dealing with centrifuges, at the same time we're dealing with human rights concerns. It just simply wasn't possible. It wasn't as far as diplomatic progress could take us. In my opinion, what we need to do is something that's more incremental. Now, that also means it's less satisfying. But I think that incremental solutions here potentially have got some real attraction. There's no reason why we can't have every state in the region sign up to the CTBT. Ratify it. Let's get it implemented. Let's get the monitoring stations going. And by the way, I think the same thing with my country too, right? I don't think there's any reason why we can't have the Chemical Weapons Convention ratified by every country in the region. Why we can't have progress in terms of limiting the spread of enrichment and reprocessing technologies in the Middle East. Have everybody agree in the region not to move their enrichment programs further than they are today. For some, that means nothing. Right? And for other states, it might be very small. But it starts to ratchet down concerns about proliferation being runaway. And in my opinion, that's what we ought to spend the next 10 to 15 years doing. Building up the non-proliferation institutions, maybe not fairly. Every country won't have the same rights and practical use of those rights at the same time. Right? But it will put a cap on how much worse things can get. And that over time, you may be able to have confidence go up such that you can start tackling the tough issues. Start tackling issues of, such as deal with Israel's nuclear posture, deal with ballistic missiles, and so forth. But I think that if we try and bite all this off in one big bite, and try and have a Middle East free of weapons of mass destruction today, and try and force Israel's hand in that, for instance, today, there is almost zero likelihood of it actually working, and instead, actually, I think you increase tensions and hostility in the region. So that's what I think about what we ought to be able to do going forward. Does that help?
Thank you very much, Jorge Miranda. I'm the ambassador of Panama here in Turkey. You mentioned a few things about possible outcome of the next elections in the U.S. And I'm just figuring out here, how do you oversee what will be the foreign policy in both cases? Because in some manner you mentioned that you oversee that those arrangements could be in a peril if the outcome change the political situation in the administration soon. And this administration, Obama administration, have engaged, and not just in this region, but as you know, also in our region. And we were in charge past year of hosting, as you might know, the Summit of the Americas. And we didn't know that you were back channeling with Cuba at the time. I'm also thinking about other moments of life of the foreign policy of your country, on that some sort of arrangement were in peril. And I just mentioned the Panama Canal treaties. And there were some key actors that were not in favor of those treaties, but eventually they supported. I'm just recalling Howard Baker III, for instance. Based on your assumption and your analysis right now in Washington, D.C., do you think there is a chance that any administration could moderate, I mean, if there is a change, their policy towards those arrangements that you have done, your policy, your foreign policy? Thank you.
Sure. No, it's a question that has got to be on the minds of a lot of different people, especially because the differences couldn't be more sharp between the stated foreign policy ambitions of one candidate and the stated foreign policy ambitions of the other. I've not done a very good job of maintaining my academic objectivity here about which candidate I prefer, I don't think. And I won't even try to maintain that here. Look, I think that a Clinton administration will pursue very similar foreign policy lines as did the Obama administration. There are going to be some differences. Obama and Clinton come to the jobs with different views. And I think it's important to note, Clinton comes with the experience of having been Obama's Secretary of State, so she knows what worked and what didn't work. And I think she'll be in a position to think, yeah, we tried that. And we only tried it 4 years ago. It wasn't that long ago. It's not as if she's trying to think about what we tried in 1992. So I think, take for instance the Middle East. Let's stick with the Middle East for just a moment. I don't think you're going to see sharp differences about how a Clinton administration would handle the nuclear deal, for instance, from Obama. They're both going to try and make sure it works, and they're both going to make sure the nuclear piece is strongly enforced. They're going to work with the IAEA and with partners, but also with the Iranians to address any implementation issues that come up. I think a Clinton administration would make the sanctions relief work. Again, you got to remember that her national security advisor is Jake Sullivan. Well, Jake was part of the negotiating team, and there are more than a few people who were involved in the Obama-Iran policy who are affiliated with the campaign now too. So there's a lot of continuity there. But I think there's also a sense that some policies that have at least a relationship with Iran didn't work. Syria is a case in point in all this. And I think that Clinton has been very direct in saying that she disagrees with the president about his Syria policy. And she would be much more in favor of safe zones and safe havens and a more militarily active policy, let's say, in Syria than what Obama has been willing to accept. I would look at that, and maybe I'm wrong, but I would look at that as a difference of degree, not of polarity. Whereas in a Trump administration, I think things would be profoundly different, assuming he does what he says he will do. And this is a fundamental question that none of us can answer. All other things being equal, I know a lot of the people who would be part of a Republican foreign policy machine and part of that administration. They would pursue somewhat different policies, but not that much different, right? The continuity in U.S. foreign policy over the last 30 years has been pretty strong. Frankly, you can make that argument going back through the Cold War. There are differences in degree. Carter emphasized more human rights than Ronald Reagan did, but there was still a lot of harmonization there. Cold War was still something that they were interested in winning, right, on both sides of this. You can make the same argument about support for the fight against terrorism. Obama has used drones much more than Bush did, in part because Bush didn't have access to as many drones as Obama did. But I mean, again, from the perspective of fighting terrorism, both have been quite strong on this, I think, and have pushed it forward. And I think the same thing applies with regard to Cuba. Just going now into the new region. I mean, Obama sought to open Cuba and the relationship between the United States and Cuba because he thought the embargo didn't work anymore. I have seen zero indication that Hillary Clinton thinks we ought to put the embargo back on, right? I think that she thinks it was the right thing to do as well. Let's not forget she was also part of the new relationship between the United States and Myanmar, right? And I think it shows a bent in her foreign policy thinking too, which is engagement. Use engagement as a tool. We're not trying to do isolation here. Goes to a question of, do I think Trump would put the embargo back on Cuba? No, I don't think so. Again, because I think the foreign policy establishment in Washington has accepted that the embargo was a waste of time and it was making things worse. But I don't think we can be sanguine about that because we just don't understand what all his foreign policy arrangements are going to, his mindset is going to really be. And so if I had to really, give you a very simple answer, I think I would say Clinton will pursue a very similar foreign policy as Obama did, but potentially changed in recognition of the things that she saw that didn't work for the better, hopefully, doing something a little bit different than what he had done. With Trump, I don't think we can really predict right now. The only predictor we have is if he were to bring on the same kind of Republican establishment people that we've seen in previous administrations, then we could see. But if he doesn't, and most of those people are saying they're not going to join a Trump administration, then really no one knows. I hope that helps.
Thank you very much. My name is Christoph Hallier from the German Embassy. Interesting enough, you did not mention Europe up to now and the role the EU played in finding or coming to a conclusion. In the beginning of your presentation, you highlighted that the relationship between the US and Iran continues to be strained, shaped and characterized by a certain degree of mistrust. It seems to me that the Europeans, throughout the negotiations, were the bridge between the US and Iran. Do you see, for the time to come, that there is still a role for the Europeans to play in terms of confidence-building measures to build up trust?
Absolutely. And I think if I neglect to use the word Europe at any point, it's because it's a mouthful to say the United States, European partners, Russia, and China, and so forth. We felt the entire time we were doing the negotiations that we were strong partners, and that our European partners brought a tremendous amount to the table, and were an essential component of us getting a deal. And I also think that that's been true throughout the whole process. The imposition of sanctions, the maintenance of those sanctions, the negotiation way of those sanctions, all of that reflected a pretty strong U.S.-European consensus here. And I think the same thing is happening today. The United States and Europe are strong partners on this issue. I think they think about it in much the same way. And in my opinion, there's been a lot of talk about how now that trade is reopening and the United States isn't part of it, but Europe is, now there's a split that's going to emerge between the United States and Europe. I frankly don't see it. And I don't think that we should expect that to be the case. As I point out to many of my friends who are skeptical of the Iran deal, let's not forget that Europe had really strong trade ties with Iran before the sanctions and was willing to absorb the hit of taking away those trade ties, through the imposition of those sanctions. And I don't think we should believe they wouldn't do that again if the circumstances warranted. I think actually that kind of goes to the point on the confidence building side between the United States, or between Europe and Iran. Iran, I don't think, looks at Europe as being different on a fundamental level than the United States. Certainly there's a difference in the political history, certainly there's a difference in the legal ability to do trade, and certainly there's a difference in the proximity. And yes, it's the year 2016, but let's not forget proximity is still an important predictor of how much trade and political relationships you have. We're pretty far away from Iran, and our possibility of having trade with Iran is pretty minimal. Europe is a heck of a lot closer, and so therefore there's always going to be a much greater degree of relationship building as a result of all that. But I think at the end of the day, the Iranians are just as upset with Europe as they are with the United States if sanctions relief doesn't manifest and if they don't get the trade benefits that they want. And I don't think that they look at Europe as being that bridge to try and make a compromise on this issue or that issue. I'll tell you honestly that there were many times where it was the United States was a bridge between a particular government in the E3 and with Iran about concerns that we didn't really think were that big of a deal, but that particular European country thought was a big deal. And there were times where the opposite was true, and a European country was working as interface between the United States and Iran. Really, I look at us more as 4 countries plus the European Union that were all playing on the same team. Sometime I had the ball, and sometime my European friend had the ball. And that points to the issue of confidence building. I don't think there's much that the EU can do that would build a lot of confidence in Iran if they had fundamental concerns with us, because they wouldn't think, as much as they've tried to divide and conquer between the United States and Europe, I don't think they have confidence that they'd be able to do that. Not the same way that they can with other countries in the international community, maybe other countries in the region. I think the best thing from a confidence-building perspective that Europe can do right now actually is get that trade and get that financing going. And this goes to that fundamental question of the degree to which European banks are prepared to go back and doing business inside of Iran. There's obviously a lot of concern with regard to U.S. sanctions. We can talk about that too if you'd like. But I think when I've talked with European banks, they've told me that the big problem is U.S. sanctions, and the big problem is Iran, and the big problem is there isn't any profit in it, and the big problem is there's a lot of problems. And I don't think that solving any one of those problems necessarily addresses that. But if there's one place where Europe has got, I think, an outsized role, it's getting that trade going and seeing what they can do to convince their own banks and institutions that now is the time to get the actual money starting to flow into Iran. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Seminer, the Embassy of Finland. As a follow-up to the question of our
German colleague, maybe a question more related to Turkey and EU, of course. I mean, you mentioned rightly interestingly the opportunity for the next 10 and 15 years' time, and you stressed the proximity US, European and Iranian interests. My question is, how would you see Turkey in this? I mean, US, Europe, Turkey and Iran. Where do you see, including the particular also challenging relationship between the EU and Turkey at the moment?
That's an awful lot to unpack. So let me offer just a few thoughts, and I'm conscious of the fact that I'm probably surrounded by more experts of Turkey than I could ever hope to be, including by my embassy colleagues over here and all of you who are here from embassies that are local. So I'm giving you a very outsider's view, maybe, and maybe that's helpful here. I mean, look, from my perspective, Turkey's relationship with Iran is complicated by the virtue of proximity, right? The virtue of natural and historic trade ties, which just simply exist because of that proximity. The fact that there are political relations that have existed for quite some time, the fact that there is a earnest desire, at least as I perceive it, by the current Turkish government to try and have a good relations with neighbors, policy to the extent possible, and even in the height of what I saw as being a real political disagreement over Syria and what happened in Syria, which is profound, I think, for Turkey certainly, and I think for Iranian perceptions of their interests in Syria. I didn't ever perceive that broke the relationship between the two sides, and that they were trying to continue to have some kind of dialogue, even on these kinds of massive issues in which they disagree. From a diplomat perspective, that's a good thing, right? Very few diplomats say you shouldn't be talking, even if what you're talking about is mostly things you don't want to talk about, and which are not terribly pleasant. But I think from the perspective of keeping some working relationship there, that was a good thing, and the impression that I have is that's been maintained throughout. I think that, that said, it's very clear that Turkey's got different interests in dealing with Iran than does the United States, than does Europe, and I think it's going to always have a different relationship with Iran than the United States or European Union and European Union countries will ever have. I don't see that as potentially a problem, because in places where we really, now speaking as a former U.S. diplomat, where we really needed Turkey's help in terms of pressing the points forward with Iran about the need to prevent spiral proliferation, avoid causing concerns with their nuclear program and so forth, the Turkish government was there to help. Even in places where we disagreed about the execution of that, going back to 2010, and the disagreement we had in May of 2010 about the Tehran declaration that came out of that, we recognized in the United States that Turkey was just trying to help address a problem that it saw in its own security, and a problem it saw for regional stability and regional security, and I think saw that as a positive thing. So I guess what I would say is, I don't see there being sharp breaks between the United States and Turkey on Iran. I don't see there being sharp breaks between the European Union and Turkey on Iran. I see there as being differences by degree in terms of their opinion as to what ought to be done in particular areas. Case in point of this, Turkey has long maintained a position that Iran should have uranium enrichment. They had this position going back years and years and years and years. We didn't like that position for quite some time. We've now accommodated that position because it was the only thing we could get with the Iranians. Bearing in mind that if the United States had its druthers, there would be no uranium enrichment inside of Iran. And I think quite the opposite may be true in Turkey. I've even had conversations where Turkish officials say, we're glad that Iran has enrichment because that means that we have not foreclosed its right and therefore foreclosed our right. So there are differences, and those differences are significant, but I don't think they've impeded our ability to work with one another when it really counts. And that, to me, is the most important thing. I don't know if that answers your question, though.
Alev, before you, I would like to ask a question which is related this with financial issues, and then let me give you the floor to you. You mentioned about the position of the European banks, and you said that you may elaborate a little bit on it. We would appreciate actually, because it's the key to see whether Iran will get the necessary funds in the upcoming period, and considering the fact that France, Italy, and Iran signed multi-billion dollars of packages recently, there can be different directions of investment between Iran and Europe. And secondly, apart from European banks, we see shift of financial centers from the west to the east, and recently China also giving so many funds to different development projects, and they are trying to establish their own financial institutions like Asia Investment Bank. So what do you perceive about non-Western investments in Iran in the upcoming period, considering the fact that sanctions is over, and what about the credit opportunities by Asian actors and Asian investments in Iran? Thank you.
No, it's a great question. I guess let me give you three different answers on this, I think, because they all relate. The first is, I think it's absolutely true that China and other countries in East Asia, but particularly China, see a real economic benefit and incentive in doing business in Iran and in the Middle East. And I think, China, you can't separate this from China's need for energy. Right? I mean, where we really saw the ties start to build between China and a lot of different countries is when natural resources are in question, whether it's in Africa for particular minerals or whether it's oil, going into the Middle East. And I think it's no question whatsoever in my mind that China has been interested in getting business going to the Middle East, in part about maintaining its own role in the economies to preserve its own energy security. And I think that is all to the good to some extent, because it's also given China the ability on issues it cares about to weigh in with countries as diverse as Iran and Saudi Arabia and others to say we need resolution of certain disputes. You can look in 2012 when we had a conflict brewing in the Persian Gulf. It was evident to me that part of the reason why the situation resolved itself is that the Iranians heard a very clear message from the Chinese: you need to stop. You need to stop inflaming tensions in the Gulf because it threatens our energy security. Again, you can look at that as being a self-centered view, or you can look at it as being self-interested and still having a positive external benefit. I think, given that, it's clear that there is going to be interest between China and Iran in doing business with one another, and certainly China as a massive emerging economy that's starting up things like the AIIB and other ways of getting financing into the emerging markets of the world. You're going to see an increased Chinese presence in all of those. But I think this is the critical issue. Thus far, what China's not been able to deliver on is the kind of quality industrial sorts of goods, primarily, that the Iranians wish to see. Iran was forced to do business with China and to get its oil and gas equipment and so forth from China because nobody else would do business with it from roughly 2008 until roughly 2013. I don't think it was its preference. I think that if Iran had its way, it would have continued doing business with Turkey and with Europe and with Japan and with Korea and with the United States, but it couldn't. And so it relied instead on its business relations with China to get what it could, not necessarily what it wanted. That's the reason why the fact that European banks aren't getting back into the business is still a problem, notwithstanding all the potential financial opportunities that exist in working with China. Because for the Iranians, they don't want to just do all of their financing and all their business in Asia, they want to be able to do it inside Europe. They want access to European hardware. They want Siemens computers. They want construction equipment from Europe and from Turkey. They want all those sorts of goods that thus far they don't think they can get in the quality they demand from Chinese markets. From that perspective, the fact that European banks are reluctant to take Iranian money is a big problem. And it's a problem that I think we need to keep looking at to see if we can come up with some practical solutions. Now, some of this, though, comes down to the fact that it's only been 5 months. We need to bear that in mind. We only had the nuclear deal implemented at the end of January this year. And here we sit at, what day is it today, the 7th or so of June? So, we're 5.25 months into this process, and that's after reversing what had been from 2006 or so a 10-year policy of banks stay out, at least coming from the U.S. Treasury Department and U.S. government, and then increasingly by European regulators. And so I think expecting banks to turn on a dime and to change their entire mindset and business operating model, particularly with all the political uncertainties that exist, whether they're in Iran or the United States, or frankly even inside Europe, with the fact that it's not terribly profitable right now, I think that's probably too much to ask too. So we both need to allow time for the situation to change, and we need to be able to work with banks to figure out what's causing them concern and try and resolve those concerns to the extent possible. And that really, to my mind, is the path for the future.
Thank you. Mr. Kılıç, sorry very much. I'm sorry, but now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Kılıç, I'm the director of a think tank, Eurasian Studies Center, and the issue I wanted to raise is very much related to the question raised by the chairman himself. I would like to hear your assessment, Mr. Nefir, of the possible foreign policy implications for Iran of its pending membership to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Thank you.
I think what that, to me, most demonstrates is Iran's reemergence into the global international political order more than anything direct, any kind of economic or security benefit, right? I think, what Iran's been trying to do over the course of the Rouhani administration, certainly, but I'd even credit the Ahmadinejad administration too, is trying to normalize its ties with the outside world to the extent possible, including by joining various different organizations and fora, by working in the UN, by being vice president of this committee and that committee in the UN, by, having UN centers operating inside of Tehran to the extent possible, and so forth. I think that is the primary benefit and the primary motivation of trying to get into the SCO. And I think that makes sense from the standpoint of an Iran that is trying to become a global leader. And I think that is certainly Iran's foreign policy ambitions. I think joining groups, though, and running committees at the UN won't necessarily solve the perception of Iran more broadly, right, if there are still residual concerns with what it does in terms of supporting terrorism and engaging itself in acts of regime instability throughout the Middle East and so forth. And so I think the impact on their foreign policy, I think, from being part of SCO, I don't think is much. I think it's a manifestation of what their foreign policy ambition has been, and it's the next step in the normalizing institutionalization of Iran as being a leader in global communities more than anything else. So that's how I see it.
Yes.
I am Doğan Bekin from Erbakan Foundation. Dear nephew, we listened to you, and you said that we would like to have a bridge for a peaceful solution between Iran and the regional countries. We welcome this view, but I want to ask some questions about the region. Obama administration and Obama himself, the President Obama, says that the security of Israel is the security of United States in the Middle East. And Israel now is going to open an office at the headquarters of the NATO in Brussels, and Israel is also a dialogue country at the Eastern Mediterranean. So Israel is under the umbrella of NATO now, and on the contrary, Israel is the only country which has nuclear power in the Middle East, and they use it in order to widen the Israeli boundaries. For instance, during the last month, Netanyahu, the Prime Minister Netanyahu himself said that Israel will not return back the Golan Heights to Syria. This is our red line. And also, on the occupied lands of the Palestinians, they construct new settlements. And what is your opinion on that? Will the United States administration make negotiation for stopping the nuclear program of Israel or not, as they act in Iran? This is very important for the peace of the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Before we go on, Richard, if there is another question, I would like to take it now because we are coming to the end of our session. So maybe getting all the questions together. If not, this will be the last question. Yes, Jim.
Jim Turner, U.S. Embassy. Just before we leave, if you could say a word about those forces who are opposed to the agreement. Under the best of circumstances, achieving success in this agreement is difficult. However, there are other parties, both within the United States and Iran, who are very opposed to having this agreement work. And we talked about the presidency, but there are other actors such as Congress, if you could mention those.
Is there any other question or comments? All right, Richard.
So thank you for both of those questions. Listen, let's be very frank here. I like to speak frankly in general, and I think on this question it's essential. The United States and Israel have a long relationship that isn't going anywhere. And I think that even when we have conflicts, as we certainly did over the nuclear deal, in which you can't imagine a more sharply political disagreement between a U.S. president and a Israeli prime minister than what we had there. We were able to maintain a relationship with Israel because we've determined that it's in our national interest and we believe that it's the right thing to do. From the Israeli perspective, I think it's certainly true that they get a lot of benefit from having a secure relationship with the United States, and I think that security benefit is something that will not change anytime soon. I think that ultimately that should, and to some extent is, stabilizing in the Middle East. I think that the degree to which countries and governments feel safe and secure, they are more able to take steps that critics would otherwise suggest make them insecure. And if you think about it, the whole reason why the Camp David Accords were able to work is because the United States was able to tell Egypt and Israel, we'll ensure both of your security by providing you substantial amounts of military assistance, among other things. And so I think ultimately, the degree to which the United States makes Israel feel secure is stabilizing in the region. You can make an argument, as I think, sir, you're to some extent making, that Israel feeling too secure gives it license to do things that you think are create instability and security problems in the region. And I understand that concern. I understand that concern, and I understand that perspective. I disagree with it. I think that the degree to which Israel feels that it is more protected from outside attack, you have a possibility of having real changes on policies that are problematic. Now, settlements, in my view, are a prime example of that. I think that the settlement policy that the Israeli government's been pursuing over the last several years is destructive to getting a real solution between Israelis and Palestinians, and by setting up a two-state solution, which I think is the only way of resolving that fundamental concern. I think that ultimately, Israel is worse off by having the expansion of settlements and by not coming to terms with the creation of a Palestinian state that would frankly include some of those territories. I think if you were to talk to an Israeli official, they would point out, but by the way, we don't exactly have a willing partner on the side of the Palestinians to try and strike a deal here too. And I think that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has got its own nasty internal disagreements and issues that frankly I don't want to touch on more than as I already have, in saying that the degree to which both the Palestinian people and the Israeli people feel that they are both stable and secure enough to come to a deal is the way in which you'll get one. And I think this is part of the reason why we provide economic assistance and support for Palestinians and security assistance and support for Israelis. And the idea is that at some point that support and that sense of stability will allow for a deal to emerge. Whether it will or not, I think is driven by more complex calculations and issues than I could speak to here. I think that issues surrounding the Golan Heights, though, and issues surrounding specific pieces of territory, all come down to the question of what's the arrangement that is reached in which they could give them back. At the end of the day, could Israel accept the Golan Heights going back to Syria? I'm not so sure that they ever could. And I think if Netanyahu's saying anything, he may be saying something that's been Israeli doctrine for a very long time. But if he were ever to be in a position, any Israeli government were to be in that position, they would have to be on the basis of real security guarantees. And they simply do not have that in the Middle East right now, and they don't have that in immediate periphery. And this goes to, the issue of the nuclear program. And I spoke about that a few moments ago with the ambassador from the Arab League. I think that ultimately, the question about what Israel's nuclear program is, what it means, and what it contains needs to be settled. This should not be an issue that remains for the next 1,000 years. But you're only going to get to a settlement of that issue when you have broadly addressed the other security challenges and issues that exist in the region. And I don't think, speaking very bluntly, that trying to get Israel to clarify its nuclear stance or to give up the Golan Heights today is going to make Israel feel better about what its security situation would be, or make it any more willing to concede things in negotiations, as inevitably they would have to. So to some extent, I think that unless you've addressed the underlying sources of instability and conflict that surround Israel, you're always going to have these issues persist. We spoke a little bit about Prime Minister Netanyahu and his opposition to the nuclear deal, which nicely transitions to issues of opponents of the nuclear deal in Washington and in Iran. Look, I think it would be too easy for me to say that it's the old guard of Iran haters in America and the U.S. haters in Iran that just want the situation to remain the same, and that change is uncomfortable. And there may be some of that. There may be some of the fact that everybody's gotten used to hating one another. And it's easier to yell about the great Satan, and it's easier to call people terrorists, and it's easier to have the kinds of policies that we have, both in Iran and in the United States, than it is to make those kinds of changes. But I don't think that's the entire issue. I think that there is a core of people in Iran who fundamentally do not trust the United States on the basis of long-standing historical grievances and a perception of security risks today. There are the same sorts of people in the United States who've got the exact same issues. And people in Iran can point to Mossadegh and can point to support for the Savak. People in the United States can point to the hostage crisis, and they can point to Khobar Towers and the Beirut barracks bombing. Both sides can do this. Frankly, I think the courage shown by Rouhani and by Obama is in saying, let's put those issues to the side and let's sort out a problem, because the only other solution is for us to remain in perpetual hostility towards one another, which isn't getting us anywhere. But that doesn't mean, again, that you've changed the fundamental and really deeply felt concerns that exist on the part of parts of the American, parts of the Iranian population. Now, the real question is, do they have the ability now to end the Iran nuclear deal or not? In my view, not now. Not now. Not under the current political alignments that exist in the United States and exist in Tehran. I think that the benefits, even if they're theoretical still yet, to Iran of economic openness and cooperation are too important and too vital and are judged as too serious and significant to even people like Khamenei, who otherwise distrust the Americans. And I think that that argument is still being won by the Rouhani side. I think on the American side, even skeptics of the nuclear deal, and the deepest held skeptics of the nuclear deal, are now saying things like it's not in the U.S. interest to kill the deal now because it'd be better to take our 10 to 15 years of restrictions than not. So aside from some people, like Mr. Trump, you don't have too many people saying kill the deal. And you don't have too many people saying that in Iran or in the United States. But, and it's a good place to close actually, the context of how the deal continues to be implemented is what's most vital here. If the United States starts believing that Iran is cheating on its nuclear concessions and cheating on its nuclear commitments, then those forces who are aligned against the deal will become much stronger. And frankly, they will have support from people who are supporters of the deal. I have written publicly that the deal should be scrapped if it's not addressing U.S. national security concerns. I think it is, and so it should be continued. But if it weren't, then it should go away. I think the same logic and argument applies with respect to Iran and the economic side. If Iran and Rouhani and all the folks that are aligned with him are no longer able to win the argument that it's in our interest, our economic interest, our political interest, to keep the deal going, then those forces that are aligned against, who are saying, I told you so, are going to have supporters even of people who negotiated the deal. And I would actually put all of the Iranian negotiators who I spent a lot of time with in that camp. They've got the same perspective of get rid of it if it's not achieving our security ambitions, if it's not achieving our economic ambitions. And so I think that the key thing really now is maintaining that positive context by keeping enforcement strong on both the U.S. side, on the European side, on the Russian side, Chinese side, and of course the Iranian side.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you very much for this U.S. perspective. Maybe next time we should make another meeting to listen to the European perspective and to see that vision. But it seems that we are at the beginning of the deal. We have 10 to 15 years ahead of us. A very complicated deal, 150 pages. It's really hard to understand and comprehend the deal. But it seems that we have a really important milestone ahead of us, the elections in the United States. So up until then, you have triggered so many new questions and answered to many questions so far. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming here. And thank you very much, dear guests, for coming to USAC and being part of this session. Thank you.